Hey everyone, welcome back to Card Cafe, here with another deck profile, this time for the Stride deck set Luard. It is here, another time where I felt like it's been so long since we got a long-awaited set. I've been watching these Stride decks of this and Nui just kicking the shit out of everything else in Japan all the way through, where we've just not had them, but here they are. They're finally here, and I'm going to talk about my favorite of the two, Luard, because I think it's a cool deck. Is it as good as Nui? No, not right now, especially because we're missing a promo that we'll talk more about when that promo comes out, if it comes out. I don't think we've even had confirmation at the time of recording this video that we are getting Serengal, but we'll talk more about that later. I think this deck is still fun. Full disclosure, my build is probably going to look to a lot of you a little janky. I'm aware it's a little janky, but honestly, in playtesting it, I'm kind of really digging the jankiness. I think it's working better than I was certainly expecting. But let's talk about it. What are we doing? So, firstly, the ride line is exactly what you would expect. It is the ride line for the start deck, or for the Stride deck set. This isn't a start deck. This is a lot better than a start deck. So, as always, your grade 0, when you're going second, you're right on top of it, you draw a card. The grade 1 says, when you ride on him, you get the Luard Crest, which is a mechanic, if anyone familiar with the Stride deck sets, where you get a specific crest that has unique abilities for that Stride deck set specifically. And also when you get the crest, you draw a card. So it's really great going second, because you'll draw a card off the starter, you'll draw a card off of this. So just +2 to your hand right away. Now, for the Luard Crest specifically, it does what the other crests do. It makes Luard a 13k base when you have the crest, and also says your front row gets 5,000 power for each face-up card in your G-zone, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But then the unique skill that this crest gives is that at the end of your turn, if you paid for the cost of Stride with his special effect, so if you pay for the cost of striding without discarding a grade 3, you get to take a critical trigger from your drop zone and put it on the bottom of your deck. Nice little homage to Belial Owl, I think was his name. I might be wrong on that for those from back in the good old days of the G era and remember this very annoying owl that Luard had. Like, it just went back to the deck at the end of turn. So little homage to that, and just puts crit triggers back into your deck, which helps you not deck out and also keep your trigger count up, which we really like. And then Luard, actually no. And then Leofal, the grade 2, very simple, just when you ride on top of him, you Soul Blast 1, draw a card. So great, more plussing the hand, can't argue with that. And then if you are running more copies of him in your deck, which I'm not, but if you are, then his second skill on Rearguard is when you place a grade 4 with Luard in its card name on your Vanguard circle, then you can discard a card from hand and call this to Rearguard. So decent if you like need to make sure you have some on your board to pay for the cost of Luard. It can fill that role, but honestly, I don't really think it's needed. There isn't a whole lot of things that just completely wipe out someone's entire board. Gandiva's basically gone at this point. No one's really playing it anymore. So you don't really have to worry about your whole board getting cleared off, and you usually have a good chunk of a board filled with Luard. But let's talk about the big boy himself. Again, if you've played the G era or still even play G era now, you know what this card does. So first, right off the bat, he has just an auto skill of Ritual 3. Now this is keywords. Keywords are back from the G era. For any of you new, didn't play in the G era, a bunch of the main bosses had these keywords, which were essentially a simple word that was representative of a skill or mechanic that that deck had access to. For Luard, it was Ritual, which is just if you have 3 grade 1s specifically in your drop zone, your skills are online. You just had a lot of cards that had their ritual skill, so their skills would not activate unless you had 3 grade 1s in the drop zone. And now that's back. So same idea. So obviously you're going to be running a good amount of grade 1s. You're going to want to make sure you get 3 grade 1s in your drop zone ASAP to fill that skill. But then what really makes Luard good is the next skill, which is at the beginning of your ride phase, you choose 2 normal units from your drop zone and you put them on the bottom of your deck. And if you did this, you do not have to pay for the cost of stride to go up into a grade 4. So it makes your striding free, which is huge. Now it's the beginning of ride phase, so you cannot do this when you first ride up on your first grade 3 turn, which you're playing Luard, so you're probably being forced to ride up first. So that usually doesn't matter. But the thing to keep in mind is that if you're going second and you do get to ride up while your opponent's at grade 3, you don't get to use that skill. You do have to discard a grade 3 or greater to pay the cost of stride like you normally would. But for the rest of the game, you're just putting 2 normal units from your drop bottom of the deck. And it doesn't have to be grade 1s either, which is cool. So a lot of the time you will put some grade 1s back, but you got to be a little bit careful with your ritual count. And there are other normal units that aren't grade 1s that are very important that you want to keep recycling. So you end up usually doing like 1 grade 1 and like a 2 or a 3, depending on what your situation is and what you need. So really good skill. We love that skill. But its final skill is when you stride over Luard, you counterblast 1, you retire one of your own rear guards, and you just search your deck for 2 grade 1s, call them to the board. Now it doesn't have to be ritual cards. It doesn't have to have the ritual card. It can be any grade 1, which is very useful. You'll search for just any grade 1 that you need in the situation, call them to the board. So you kill 1, call 2. So you're +1 to the board. It does require you to have a rear guard on your board before main phase, which is why I kind of talk about, like, you could run more Leofall to kind of fill that condition. There's obviously Maple, which, spoilers, we're not running Maple in this build. So those are certainly options around that. But like I said, with the current meta, that's almost never an issue. You're gonna have a pretty full board in Luard, and yeah, a couple things will probably get retired depending on what you're playing against, but only 1 or 2. Most decks, I can't think of a single deck actually that could get rid of your entire board consistently. So not a huge deal. Do you want to run 1 or 2 Maple just to be safe? Yeah, I'm not gonna argue against that, but I don't know it's necessary per se. But yeah, so that's Luard. It's a great card. So it makes you definitely have to think about this deck. This is much more of a thinky deck than, say, Shiranui is, because you have to really be managing what grade 1s are in your drop zone, what normal units are still in your deck, what do you need that turn, and just keeping track of it through the whole time. So that's kind of why I like this better. I like the thinky decks a little bit better. Now for the grade 3s, not a whole lot. We're running 2 extra copies of Luard. He doesn't have Persona Ride, just like any of the other stride deck set grade 3s, but he does need to be discarded for the cost of a grade 3. He does need to be discarded for the cost of one of your grade 4 strides we'll talk about later. So we run a couple extra copies just to make sure we can fulfill that requirement. And also, if you find yourself in a situation where you're riding up and striding, but you can't stride with Luard's skill, it's good to have 1. You might have to discard this to pay the cost for stride if you have to do that. So 2 copies and 2 copies of the Solman Clout Dragon. I think this is a really good attacker. This is one of your best cards to go into when you're trying to finish the game, push some damage. It's a very simple skill, just Ritual 3. So you have those 3 grade 1s in your drop zone. During the battle that he attacks, it gets 10,000 power. And if you discard him for the cost of stride, so in that first stride turn where you can't lose Luard's skill, he's a great target, because if you discard him for that, you get to draw a card. So 2 copies. The space is kind of tight, and he's really only used for the kind of that good beater to call out when you're trying to really push. So 2 copies. And again, you can recycle him off of Luard's skill because it's just a normal unit. So 2 copies works pretty well. I'm finding that works perfect for this deck. Grade 2s, few more, but still not too many. We got to talk with the main girl herself first. I think the only 4 of normal, actually the only 4 of grade 2 in this deck is Morfessa. Main girl is back as a very strong card in this deck, so you gotta run 4 copies. What she says is, firstly, in your drop zone, she is considered having -1 grade continuously. So she counts as a grade 1 in your drop zone. Obviously, this is important for ritual. So any copies of her that end up in your drop zone is just fueling your ritual count. So that's great. We love that. But more importantly is her second skill, which is when it attacks a Vanguard, if you have the Luard crest, she gets 5,000 power. And if you have 2 face-up cards in your G-zone, so if you've Strowed twice, then you can counterblast 1, search your deck for a ritual unit, call it to the board. So this is your main multi-attack extender in the deck. This allows you to just push up to 5 attacks during your turn. So that's really huge. You're just trying to push for game. So your main attacker, she's a 15k attacker, which is great. Counts as a grade 1 in the drop zone to fuel ritual, and is a multi-attack extender. So not really much to say there as to playing why you run 4. I think everyone runs 4. There's no question that this is a 4 of in your deck. The non-grade 1 that is not a 4 of. Next, the things that I am running. So we are running 3 copies of the Minerva Order. So I am running this even though we don't have Serengal, the grade 1 promo, yet. The reason for that, because this is still a great early game card. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a grade 2 normal order that just says, play with Counterblast 1, you draw 2 cards, and then you either call 2 cards or discard 2 cards. There's some combination of both. So obviously you're going to just draw 2 and call 2, though you might occasionally discard grade 1s if you need to fuel ritual. You can do that too, and that's what's kind of versatile about this. But really what's here for is the early game. We're playing a Stride deck, so that unfortunately there is going to be some amount of grade 2 gaming that you need to do. I personally hate that. I hate grade 2 gaming, so I'm not a huge fan of the Stride deck sets, because I thought that was one of the worst parts of the G era, because it just took away a lot of the fun of the game. For me personally, just sitting there sticking on grade 2 waiting for someone to just ride up, I don't think that's fun. But it's the unfortunate nature of how striding works. So in order to win the grade 2 game, you got to keep resources up in the early game. So we run 3 copies of an order that just says draw 2, call 2, essentially. With the amount of grade 1s and 2s that you run, being the main grades in your deck, easy to be able to just rush your opponent in the early game. So I really like 3 copies of this in order to just keep up momentum in the early game. Then we run 2 copies of our favorite girl, Turnar. I think she keeps slowly creeping into more and more of my Keter decks. So we're running this mainly for resource management. You can go through a lot of Counterblast and a good amount of Soul too, considering the grade 1s that we'll talk about in a second. And I found she's come in super clutch, because it is very easy in this deck to not only get pushed to 3 damage early, but to use up that 3 Counterblast immediately, especially with us running the Minerva Order and counterblasting in the early game. So I found it super, super helpful. Like getting my opponent to think that they've like starved me out of counterblast, I can't do anything, only for me to throw her down. I'd be like, nope, boop, into soul, countercharge 1. So for people who don't actually know what she does, I should actually talk about it. Is at the end of the battle that she attacked, if you have 3 face down cards in your damage zone, she goes to the soul and you countercharge. So she's giving you soul and countercharge back. So I really like her, and she's a normal unit that once you use her, she goes into your soul. You can soul blast her out and then put her back into the deck with Luard. So we love that, to be able to just draw into her later. So 2 copies, working out really well. And then lastly, for the grade 2s, we're running 1 copy of During. This card is interesting, and it kind of just is a good one of you sometimes. It's a when placed, if you have a Vanguard with only 1 clan, so only to be used in like the Minervas, Ezel, and this decks that are the encounter decks. That's the word I'm looking for Keter Sanctuary. It says you can Soul Blast 1, discard a card from your hand, you choose a card with only 1 clan again, and from your drop zone and put it into your hand. Now the reason we run this, spoiler, is entirely because the Stride deck set introduced a Perfect Guard. That is a 1 clan Perfect Guard. It is of the Shadow Paladin clan. So this can Soul Blast 1, take a Perfect card from your drop zone, put it back into your hand. Only running 1 copy. because again, space is a little tight. It's not a grade 1, and you being able to fetch 1 perfect card is usually just enough. Like you draw so much in this deck sometimes that you'll just end up having like 3 perfect cards in your hand. That's happened to me more than once. So I like just the 1 copy feels fine. Just like get me back 1 point through in the game. So 1 copy is working well for me. Grade 1's the biggest portion of the deck. So first and foremost, we are running 3 copies of Painkiller. This should be 4. I'll be honest. This should be 4 copies. But 3 is working out fine. I thought I had 4. I couldn't find my 4th copy. And I'm not willing to go get one when I know I have one somewhere. But 3, honestly, it's really fine because 3 you'll still see often enough. And again, Luard can just search out any grade 1. So even if you don't see Painkiller in the early game, by the time you're striding, you will be able to just search 2 of these out if you need. But I've so far in my playtesting, even with 3, I've never not seen this in the early game. Thankfully, also because of the order and drawing E card. So 3 copies of Painkiller, just a very simple grade 1 that says when she boosts, you Soul Blast 1, retire herself, draw a card. So great for fueling ritual count, right? Because you can Soul Blast out your grade 1, your ride line, ideally, and then she retires herself. So that's immediately in the early game 2 cards to your ritual count. Out of the 3 that usually almost all of your skills would just require 3 grade 1s in the drop. So 3 to 4 copies of that. I will probably bump this up to 4 once I find my copy, but really so far 3 is working fine. 4 copies of Abyssal Owl. First card is your countercharge engine. This is simple and straightforward. It technically has 2 skills, but I'm running 4 for the countercharge because you burn through so much counterblast in this deck. So what he says is act in your hand. If you have the crest, you can discard this card, search your deck or drop for up to 1 grade 3 card with Luard in its name, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So if you find yourself like in desperate need of one of the copies of Luard that you are running in the main deck, then this can search it out for you if you need. And then also discards itself, which is fine because you're fueling ritual count. And also, more importantly for its second skill, which is at the end of your turn, if you have a Vanguard with Luard in its name, then you can take 2 copies of the Owl, bind them, and countercharge 1. So that's the thing, why you definitely want 4, because this can get you countercharge 2 over the course of the game, which can, again, be really, really important and also prevent your opponent from damage denying you. And just keep your resources going. You burn through a lot of counterblast, like I said, so making sure you have max copies of this to make sure you can countercharge as much as possible is very important. So that's the main thing is here is you run 4 copies for the countercharge. And then, let's see, for the next 4 of, we are running 4 copies of Dragheart Luard Semius, the next like best grade 1 in the deck. This card is really, really good. And why you never really have to worry about having a full board. So again, Ritual 3 continuous. So one of the cards that requires you to have 3 grade 1s in the drop zone. But what it gives you is, firstly, this unit gets 2,000 power so long as you have Ritual 3 and the Dragheart Crest. So that's part that never. Any skill that says you have to have the Dragheart Crest, like for standard purposes, for playing this deck in standard, that doesn't matter. You're gonna have the crest no matter what. So it's 2,000 power, which is great. It's a 10k booster most of the time, so that makes really good numbers with like your grade 3 here and another grade 1 that we're going to talk about in a second. So we love 10k boosters for that reason. But its other skill is what really shines, which is GB1, which is a skill we haven't really talked about yet. GB1 is based on Generation Break, I think was the full term. And it just means how many face-up cards you have in your G-Zone. So, or on Vanguard. So if you have a grade 4 on your Vanguard from your Stride, then GB1 is active. If you have 2 face-up cards in your G-Zone, or 1 face-up in your G-Zone and 1 on Vanguard, GB2 is live, so on and so forth. This is GB1. When it's placed on rear guard, other than during the battle phase, If you have a Luard Vanguard in its name, you get to look at the top 2 cards of your deck, call one of them to the board, the other goes to the bottom of your deck. So really strong card. This lets you kind of keep up your board presence. You just throw this down or just search it off of Luard's skill, look at the top 2, call something, bot deck the other. And at the end of the turn, that card is retired that you called. That almost never happens. A lot of the time you'll be calling something that either removes itself or is going to get called over during the battle phase because you're multi-attacking. So the fact that it kills the thing that it calls at the end of the turn is not a restriction or like a cost of this card at all. That's not going to matter. Especially if I find a lot of the times with this card I'm able to call things like Turnar off the top, which is just a great feeling because then this is just going to get tucked into the soul before that retirement activates. So 10k booster and also fills up your board. Great card, 4 of, and a grade 1. Good card. Definitely 4 copies. And then a card I'm surprised I'm not seeing more people running more copies of. I think they see like 1, if anything, and then a lot of people aren't running this at all, is the Lumicity Wizard, which I love this card. I think this card is really good. What this card says is Ritual 3, again, so your 3 grade 1s in your drop zone. When it's placed on rear guard, it gets 10,000 power. So just straight up Ritual 3, throw this down, and GB1. So you have to have the face-up card, Energy Zone, or Stride in your Vanguard. 10,000 power. But that's great when she's striding because that's making some really good numbers. This deck kind of struggles with numbers, especially in the earlier parts when you're just starting your stride. This helps with that a lot because it becomes either an 18k attacker or an 18k booster, which is huge. And like I was saying, where you have Semius, a 10k booster, behind this, that makes some really good numbers immediately. This becomes a 28k line, 33 if you have 1 face up, 38, 43, so on and so forth. So I like having this just as the extra card to like kind of call out as you're pushing alongside the grade 3. These are like your 2 that I'm using as your main pushers for power and damage. But that second skill, I think, is equally as important, which is when it's retired from rear guard during your turn. If you have Vanguard with Luard, or you have the Crest, excuse me, if you have the Luard Crest, you soul charge 1 and give your Vanguard 5k. The 5k on Vanguard's fine, that's whatever, your Vanguard's probably any perfect guarded anyway. What's really important is the soul charge. Because again, you're going through not only your counterblast really fast, but you're going through a good amount of soul because of painkiller, and you're recycling your painkillers a lot and trying to get as much draw as possible. So you can run out of soul pretty fast in this deck, not to mention Durang Soul Blast, your grade 2 Ride Line Soul Blasts. So I really like having this card just to keep the soul generating and be able to keep that resource up as well as counterblast. So it's 18k beater or booster. It soul charges for you. It's just a great target for Luard's skill to counterblast 1, sack one of your rear guards, call 2. This is the perfect target for that because it soul charges 1 and then gives the 5. But that also activates just for you calling over this. So you can have this in the front row, attack with it for like 18, 23, 28, depending on how many face up you have in the G zone. Call over it, soul charge 1, 5k to your Vanguard. So great card, 3 of. Just isn't space enough for 4. And 4 might be a little excessive, but I think 3 is a good number for it. And I like it. I'm really liking it so far. Now, kind of my tech choice that I think is going to raise some eyebrows is the Dragon Tree Wretch for Keter. So this is a bit of an older card from out in set 9. I'm not even going to talk about the first skill. The first skill does not matter. It's not relevant to this whatsoever. It's just that's the skill related to the Dragon Tree stuff. Is the second skill that this is here for, which is once per turn, when your rear guard is placed in the same column as this, you counterblast 1 draw card. Another card that we're running pretty much exclusively for the early game, early to mid game, because of Grade 2 gaming, right? Grade 2 gaming, where you throw this down, throw something in front of it, counterblast 1, draw a card back. Again, keeping momentum up and keeping the pressure of just having bigger lines, bigger columns, and it's a grade 1. So it counts towards a ritual. You can search it off Luard technically, and you're using up counterblast in the early game, which I know is kind of a weird thing to say, but it's because of Turnar. So it's another way to just kind of immediately turn Turnar on to be activated. Because that's something I kind of found in other decks like Ezel, where I was running Turnar, but I just wasn't actually going through Counterblast fast enough for her to be useful right away. So a lot of the times with other decks, I'd have Dragheart, but she'd be a dead card because she doesn't work until you have 3 face down damage. So she would just be a dead card that wouldn't be doing anything for me, and usually would just get retired or called over because she couldn't work. In this deck, that is not a problem, partially because of Dragheart Luard. It's very easy to go through Counterblast very fast in this deck, so I like that for being able to turn Dragheart on immediately, and also again just keep the drawing engine going. You're probably not going to use him in the late game. I don't think there's ever been a situation in the like mid to late game where I've used him, because at that point you got to be really careful with your Counterblast. But in the early game, when I've been seeing him, been using him a lot, actually, more than I thought I was going to. That's why I said at the beginning, this might look a little janky, but it's actually kind of working better than I was expecting. And this is a big example of this card I kind of threw in as an afterthought. I needed to fill slots, and we don't have Serengal the promo yet. I was like, it's a grade 1. It technically draws me a card, and probably occasionally be useful. Actually working out really well. Wouldn't run more than 2. Again, because of the Counterblast, and you will not want to use his Counterblast eventually. But in the early game, this card is actually working out very well, and I'm liking him a lot. So 2 copies, but definitely an easy replace if there's some other things you want to go up in. And finally, we already talked about it, the Shadow Paladin, Perfect Guard, and of course 1 Sanctitude. The Shadow Paladin Perfect Guard is like all the other Nation Perfect Guards. You know, 1 less card in hands. You don't discard for the cost of Perfect Guarding. And Sanctitude is all the more important now because if your opponent's Vanguard has the text Triple Drive, you don't have to discard a Perfect Card, which all of the strides have Triple Drive. So now with Luard and Shiranui being in the meta, incredibly important. So 3-in-1 split there. And that is our grade 1s. So on to just the triggers left. We are running 4 copies of basic crits, 5 copies of basic crits actually, and 3 copies of the Nation Effect crit. I like this just because emergency situations, you might just want the 5k instead of the 4k. The Go to Soul can occasionally be nice, but your board's usually going to be full with other stuff anyway. So if you run a 1/4 of this, it doesn't really matter in this deck, if I'm being honest. But what does matter is 8 crit. Definitely want to run 8 crit. This deck, like I said at the beginning, it's got a little bit of a numbers issue, and just kind of pressure in general until you really get going isn't there. So I like 8 crit to keep that pressure up and put more pressure on, try and crit my opponent early, push them to higher damage so that the multi-attacking you can do in your strides has more impact. So 8 crit there. For right now, I'm doing 3 draws. I'm considering changing this to fronts. I know what I've been talking about since Set 13 came out with how much front 20k shields matter right now. And the thing is, if you're not seeing your draw pieces early, you're going to be kind of lacking in hand is the problem. There aren't really, aside from Painkiller and the Dragon Tree Wretch, there's not a whole lot of plussing that you do. So I kind of like still having draws, but so far in my testing, hand definitely hasn't been an issue. So I might switch back to fronts. It's definitely something that's a little bit more player preference. If you'd prefer to have the fronts, I'm certainly not going to argue the point. I think draws just kind of have their place depending on what your game state is. But certainly a flex spot. I'll probably test with it a little bit more and try out the fronts and see how I like the fronts. But for now, I think I would still recommend draws. Then heal triggers. Big change for me if you've been watching my deck profiles. We're not running generics. There are no generic heals to be seen here. We are now running 2 copies of the grade heal. I alluded to this back a couple weeks ago with my Omnia Gruzio update deck list, that now that we have these stride decks in the meta and very dominant in the meta, we are now running the grade heals. So if anyone who doesn't know, the grade heals say if your opponent's Vanguard is grade higher than you, this gets 10,000 extra shield. So this is a 20k shield if your opponent is a grade higher than you, which if they've strode and are on a grade 4, they're always going to be higher than you. So 2 copies of this now, and probably going to be for the foreseeable future, at least until Divine Z comes out. I might change it when Divine Z stuff comes out, but for right now, definitely 2 of the grade heals, and then 1 each still of the crit and the restand heals. Both definitely still have their place in the meta right now. Again, when Divine Z comes out, this is probably going to switch to a 2-2 split of the restand heal because of Varga, and then still 2 of these because of Shernui and Luard, and cutting the crit heal because Youthberg and Jejeweled will be less prevalent at that point. But right now, Youthberg and Jejeweled are still very prevalent, so I like having at least 1 copy of the crit heal. But if you want to make the switch now to 2 and 2, because of Shiranui restanding and Leonore restanding, I mean, I won't blame you, but just like I said, with Youthberg and Jejeweled still very much being here, I would recommend at least one crit heal, but 2 of the great heals for sure. And last of the triggers, the over trigger reveal. We are running blue over trigger. I'll be honest, I don't feel very strongly about any of them in this deck. Blue just kind of wins by process of elimination. The Keter OT is the Keter OT, which is arguably one of the worst ones, especially now. The red OT, there's no rear guards in your deck that really take advantage of the restand. If you watch my other deck profiles, you know I've talked about that, where I don't really believe in the red OT anymore unless you have a rear guard that either gains a crit or some sort of guard restrict. And that leaves the blue OT. But even here, it's like, aside from a perfect guard, there's not really a whole lot of things I really want back in my hand. I want my things to stay in the drop zone. But the crit is nice, and occasionally putting like perfect guard if I don't have Domag back to put perfect guards in my hand, I guess that's cool. I guess you can fetch a grade 3 if you really need it, but again, I want to put those things back from my drop zone into the deck. So that's the thing where it's like putting something from your drop zone into your hand, not super useful in this deck. It's like you're probably going to take a trigger, if anything, or a perfect guard, and that's it. Nothing else really matters. Like in some other decks where I'm like, yeah, they're cards that you are looking for that are key pieces to your mechanic. This deck doesn't really have that, but lacking any better options, we're running the blue. Maybe when the festival collection coming out in the summer with the 2 new overtriggers, we're getting one of those, will be a better synergy to Luard. For right now, I think blue is best in this deck. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we do have to talk about the 2 strides. So I'm not really beat around the bush here. Let's talk about them both. The 2 SPs that come with the stride deck. I'm not a cool kid who got the premium ones, and so all of mine are SPs. All I have are these 2 SPs. But so, these are your grade 4s that you'll be going into. You'll primarily be going into this one, and only occasionally going into the other one. But you got Drag Driver and Drag Strider. So, what are strides? We've been talking about them throughout this whole deck profile. For those who don't know, though anyone that doesn't play premium or wasn't around back for G, this is just a grade 4 that exists in a separate zone called the G zone. You discard a grade 3 after your ride phase and before your main phase, unless you're using Luard's skill, to take a card from this extra zone and ride it on your Vanguard. And then the pet takes the power of your Vanguard, and this adds it together. So that's why it says, it's a little hard to see because of the SP foiling, but it says plus 15 for the power. That means it's taking Luard's power as your base, or heart, quote unquote, as it's called, and adding it to it. So it's always going to be base 28k, because you're adding the 13k from Luard onto 15, always 28. So Drag Strider, the main one you're going to be going into, is pretty straightforward. It's when he attacks, you counterblast 1. If you're in Ritual 3, turn a card face up in your G zone. Does not need to be the same name as him, which is ideal because you can just flip up copies of this, honestly. You just search your card for a card with a ritual ability, does not have to be grade 1s, which we like that, and call it to the board, shuffle your deck. So multi-attack extender, that with Morfessa gets you 5 attacks, which we love, and as a lot of the time you're going to be calling Big Boy Dragon since he comes out as a 23k beater by himself. Or call Morfessa too, if you don't have her. So straightforward, simple, flipping a card up in your G zone so you're getting that 5k from the crest, and then calling a card for extra attacks. So the reason why you're not going into Driver as much is because, for one, you do have to discard a copy of grade 3 Luard to pay for the cost of Stride. You can't just discard any grade 3. Now, that doesn't super matter because you can still get around that with Luard's on Stride skill to put 2 normal units back to Stride, so that doesn't super matter. But not only do you need to have the Ritual 7, so having 7 grade 1s in your drop zone, your whole board when he attacks needs to be 5 Ritual units. Not super hard to meet in this deck, even with stuff running like Turnar and Durang and Painkiller. The majority of this deck is Ritual units, so that's not super hard, but still a little annoying. And for all of that, you get 10,000 power plus 1 crit. But then additionally, if you pay the additional cost of retiring 2 rear guards and discarding a copy of Luard from your hand, he then gets the main skill that you're going to want it for, which he gets a +1 drive and guard restrict. And that guard restrict is your opponent cannot guard with sentinels. So if you're going into this as like a 3rd stride, maybe a 2nd, depending on the situation, but certainly not any sooner, most likely 3rd. If it has gone to this by this point, once you use his skill, you've got at least 3 cards face up in your G zone. You're getting 15,000 to the front row. He's getting 10,000 power and a crit. So he's already 28, 38, 48, 53 with a crit, quad drive, and your opponent cannot sentinel. Now, that's a big number to try and stop, and that's unboosted. But Sanctitude exists. So I will not and would never recommend going into Drag Driver unless confirmed Sanctitude is out. You have seen your opponent either use this or it has hit the damage zone, or they soul charged it, or something is this is gone. Your opponent does not have this. Otherwise, there's a huge feel bad moment. You go into this, do the big thing, and they just throw down Sanctitude. Because Sanctitude is not being guarded from hand, because the guard restrict of Drag Striver is still they cannot guard with sentinels from hand. And as we've talked about multiple times with Sanctitude is not being guarded from hand. It is technically going to the Guardian Circle. Or sorry, it's not going from the hand to the Guardian Circle, it's going from the hand to the Order Zone. So it gets around the guard restrict and it still has triple drive, so they don't even have to discard. So unless Sanctitude is confirmed out of their deck, you're not going into you're not going into this card. You will always just go into this until Sanctitude is out. Once Sanctitude is out, if you have the setup, you have the Luard, yeah, sure. And they're at like 4 damage. Going for Drag Driver, it can be a good finisher if you know that they do not have Sanctitude. But they'll probably be trying to hold on to Sanctitude until you go into Drag Driver. So that's why a lot of the time you will just be continuously going to Drag Strider, flipping this up for the cost so you can keep just going into this until they've burned out their Sanctitude or they're just dead. Because you're still, every time you go into this, you've got 4 to 5 attacks, usually 5 attacks, which is still really good, especially once you get the numbers going. So those are your strides. Drag Driver, Drag Strider. I can never get these two messed up in my head. Oh, God. Drag Strider, it can be a good finisher if they do not have Sanctitude. But even then, they might even have the overtrigger in their hand they can throw down. That's already 63. A couple more triggers, they're probably at least passing it with some amount of guard. So, but yeah, that is the list. I'm enjoying this. I like this deck. Like I said, it's a little bit more technical, a little higher ceiling for playing it than Shiranui, not to throw shade at the Shiranui players. But that deck is a little bit more helmet, doesn't require quite as much resource management for sure, as also just making sure not only you have the Counter Blast and the Soul Blast, but also that you are maintaining your ritual count, having the right cards when you need them, putting the right cards that you need for the situation from your drop zone back into deck. So there's a lot to think about. That's why I like it as opposed to Shiranui. But I'm having a lot of fun with it, and this build is a little silly, as you can see, but it's working. Certainly better than I was expecting. With that being said, once the promo doggo is confirmed and we get it, I am 100% throwing all the jankiness out, and the dog is going in at 4. We will talk about that, I'm sure, if and when that comes out. My guess at this point, since it still hasn't even been confirmed, is best case scenario, Siren Gall is going to be a box topper for Divine set 1. That would be best case scenario, because then it won't be a $80 card if it's given to us in any other scenario, since every Luard player is going to want it, and all the Raziel players are going to want it, because Raziel also works very well with the dog promo. So look forward to that. Just more promo hell that we keep finding ourselves in, because Bushiro doesn't know how to do promos. But we're just praying every night that the dog promo is a box topper for Divine Z set 1, because then it will at least be marginally okay to get. It'll be a decent number floating around. So that's the hope and the dream. We'll see what happens. Definitely 4 copies of that when we get to it. But for right now, I'm liking my build. It's fun. Certainly throwing people off with some of the cards that I'm running, but it works, and that's the main part, and I'm definitely going to be playing this for a little bit, and you'll be seeing it on the channel in some matches coming up soon. But if you have any questions, yeah, shoot them in the comments. I'm happy to answer them, and otherwise, we'll see you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.